10:24 p.m. October 21, 1969. A phone rings inside the Oakland Police Department. An officer picks it up, and on the other end is a voice with no panic in it at all. Calm. Unhurried. Almost bored, like a man reporting a fender bender instead of confessing to murder. He says he wants a lawyer. Live. On television. By morning. And if they refuse, his exact words, he'll go out that night and clean off the whole city. The call is traced to a payphone. 4 blocks away, at that exact same minute, a woman named Kathleen Johns is scrambling out of a moving stranger's car on the shoulder of a freeway, her baby daughter in her arms, running through the dark with no idea how close she just came to becoming victim number 7. Forget everything you think you know about this case. Forget the ballistics report. Forget the composite sketch you've seen recycled on every other channel that's ever covered this story. Because this isn't really a story about a killer. It's a story about a man who figured out something far more dangerous than any knife or gun, that fear doesn't need a face to spread. It just needs a voice, a letter, a promise whispered into the right ears, and a public terrified enough to keep listening. Between December 1968 and October 1969, less than 11 months. The San Francisco Bay Area recorded 5 confirmed attacks by a man who signed his letters with a crossed circle, a symbol the newspapers printed on their front pages until it looked less like a signature and more like a crosshair. He called himself Zodiac. He hunted young couples parked in secluded lovers' lanes. He shot a cab driver in the back of the head on a quiet residential street, in front of witnesses who watched him walk away and wipe his prints off the door handle. And in his most theatrical act of all, he stabbed a college student on the shore of a lake while wearing a black executioner's hood stitched with his own symbol, and then calmly carved that same symbol into the door of her car before he vanished into the trees. But here's the detail that almost never survives the retelling. Zodiac didn't need to keep killing to keep controlling the city. After his 5th confirmed victim, the attacks nearly stopped. What didn't stop was the mail. 40, 50. By some counts closer to 20 verified, letters arrived over the next 2 decades, each one timed for maximum panic, each one landing exactly when the story was about to go quiet. He'd traded the knife for a mailbox. And a mailbox, it turned out, was so much more efficient. Now let's talk about the ciphers, because this is where almost every other piece of coverage gets it wrong. Zodiac sent 4 encrypted messages to Bay Area newspapers, each one a taunt disguised as a puzzle. The first, a 408-symbol cipher split across 3 separate letters, was cracked in less than a week, not by the FBI's cryptography division, not by military intelligence, but by a high school teacher and his wife, hunched over graph paper at their own kitchen table late into the night. Buried inside it was a line that made detectives' blood run cold. Killing, the cipher said, was more fun than hunting animals, because man was the most dangerous animal of all. The second cipher, 340 characters, dense and merciless, sat completely unbroken for 51 years. 51 years. Longer than most of the original detectives on this case even lived. It wasn't the government that finally cracked it. It was 3 total strangers on 3 different continents. A Belgian programmer, an Australian mathematician, an American puzzle constructor, who found each other online and spent months trading messages back and forth, treating a serial killer's 40-year-old riddle like a Sunday crossword nobody else could finish. What they finally uncovered in December 2020 wasn't a confession. It wasn't a name. It was something colder than that. A taunt about the afterlife, a line boasting that he wasn't afraid of the gas chamber because it would only send him to paradise faster. 51 years of silence, broken to reveal a man still mocking everyone from somewhere no one could reach him. And that right there is the part that should unsettle you more than any single murder in this case. Because a killer who stops attacking but keeps writing hasn't retired, he's just changed weapons. And the file on this case holds something almost no other unsolved investigation in American history has: a suspect list that keeps growing instead of shrinking, decade after decade, because the internet didn't just preserve the Zodiac case. It resurrected it. Again. And again. Every single generation, someone new picks up exactly where the last obsessive was forced to stop. In part 2, we go inside the 4 names investigators actually took seriously. Including the one man whose own family says he confessed, sitting in her living room, decades after the killing stopped. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Every unsolved case collects theories the way a crime scene collects fingerprints, messy, overlapping, most of them leading nowhere. The Zodiac case collected a courtroom's worth of them. But out of literally hundreds of named suspects across 56 years, only 4 names were ever taken seriously by the investigators who actually lived inside this file. The first is Arthur Lee Allen. A former elementary school teacher, a convicted sex offender, a man who owned a knife matching the exact description given by a surviving victim, and who once worked at a hardware store that sold the precise brand of boot that left prints at one of the crime scenes. Police searched his home. Twice. They found nothing that could conclusively tie him to the murders in a courtroom. He died in 1992. He was never charged with a single killing. The second name is quieter, and somehow stranger. Lawrence Kane. The case against him doesn't come from forensics or fingerprints at all. It comes from family. His own stepdaughter says that decades after the murders had stopped making headlines, she watched him casually reference specific details of the crimes, details that had never once been released to the public. No charges were ever filed. No confession was ever recorded on tape. But it's exactly the kind of testimony that keeps a 50-year-old case breathing long after the physical evidence has gone completely cold. The third name belongs to Richard Gaikowski, floated by a Bay Area television producer who swore she recognized his voice, instantly, unmistakably, from a taunting phone call she'd heard decades earlier. The fourth, and perhaps the most publicly persistent of all, is Gary Francis Post, named in a 2021 documentary that claimed to match his DNA, his personal typewriter, and even a visible scar in old photographs to Zodiac's known letters. The FBI reviewed every piece of that evidence. Their answer was blunt: it didn't meet the standard required to reopen a closed case. Here's what should actually keep you up tonight: not one of these 4 men was ever definitively excluded either. The DNA recovered from Zodiac's own letters had already been degraded, by postal workers, by journalists, by police officers who in 1969 had no idea they were contaminating evidence for a test that wouldn't even exist for another 30 years. This case isn't unsolved because nobody has a theory. It's unsolved because the evidence itself can no longer answer the question with any certainty, no matter how convincing any single theory sounds at 2 in the morning on a true crime forum. And that's the real horror sitting underneath this entire case. It was never really about the crossed circle symbol. It was never really about the executioner's hood at Lake Berryessa. It's the fact that somewhere between 6 confirmed murders and dozens of taunting letters, one man built a myth so effective that even after his own death, if he's even dead, the case simply refuses to close. Every few years, a fresh claim resurfaces. A new cipher gets solved on some forum at 3 a.m. A new DNA test gets requested, and quietly denied. Zodiac didn't just evade capture. He engineered a case that would keep investigating itself for 60 years and counting. If you want part 3, the theory investigators still refuse to rule out, involving a man who wasn't publicly named until 2023, tell us in the comments, and subscribe so it reaches you the second it's live. In 2023, a retired investigator. A man who'd spent 30 quiet years working this file completely outside any official task force, did something almost nobody connected to this case has ever done. He went on the record. He gave a name. A man who had crossed paths with 2 separate victims before they died. A man whose alibi for one of the attacks depended entirely on a single family member, who has since passed away and can never be questioned again. A man whose handwriting a forensic examiner privately called inconclusive but troubling, in a report that stayed buried until a records request finally forced it into daylight, 3 years ago. The investigator wouldn't call it a confession. He wouldn't even call it proof. What he called it, in his own words, was this: the closest anyone has ever gotten to hearing the man say it himself, without him actually saying it out loud. And then he refused to elaborate on camera. For the rest of his life. That's the sentence true crime channels love to end on, because it sounds like an answer. It isn't one. And maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath 56 years of ciphers, sketches, and a suspect list that has never once stopped growing. Every unsolved case eventually stops being about the killer, and starts being about us. The people who never stopped looking. The teacher and his wife, hunched over a kitchen table with graph paper. 3 total strangers on Discord who cracked a 51-year-old riddle for absolutely no reward except the answer itself. A retired investigator who carried one final name all the way to his own retirement, and never once said it loud enough for the record. Zodiac didn't just take 5, 6, maybe more lives. He took something else, 2 decades of attention from people who were never, ever going to stop looking, because he made absolutely certain the story would never let them. Maybe that was the entire point, all along. Not to be caught. Just to never, ever be forgotten. If this is the version of the Zodiac story you've never heard laid out quite like this before, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which one of these 4 names you think deserves an entire episode of its own.